It's now hard to imagine a world without technology to guide our everyday lives. Today, we simply key in a destination and off we go, being guided every step of our journey.
In 2.1 miles, turn right onto Main Street.
How did we ever get anywhere without GPS? And for some of us, it wasn't that long ago that we relied on printed maps, spread out across our dashboard, wondering how we missed that last turn. And if we were really serious about our travels, we might even invest in the status symbol of the 80s and 90s, a Mapsco book. But what about the pioneers on the trails in the 1840s? There was no GPS, no AAA, no Mapsco. How did they find their way across the great American desert as it was coined by scientific explorer Stephen H. Long in 1820? The early settlers, like the Whitmans and Spaldings, and other missionaries such as the Walkers, Cushings, Smiths, and Grays, relied on fur trappers to guide them over the Rockies and into the unknown territories beyond. Men like Jim Beckworth, James Kleiman, Andrew Drips, Caleb Old Greenwood, and Elijah Stevens followed footpaths and horse trails set down by the Native Americans over thousands of years, turning them into rudimentary roads that would eventually be followed by pioneers seeking a new and hopefully better life in the West. And then there were those who ventured out on their own, without the aid of a guide. As Nancy Kelsey, the only woman in the Bidwell Bartleson Party of 1841, wrote, "There were no roads and no pilot except the setting sun." Making the journey west was grueling and treacherous under the best of circumstances, but doing it on your own was a recipe for disaster, which the party realized when they almost perished in the Sierra Nevada. But as more settlers headed west, so began the era of travel guides. One of the earliest was written by Thomas J. Farnham, an explorer and author of the American West in the first half of the 19th century, traveling to Oregon in 1839 and then to California via the Sandwich Islands. Farnham would record his travels in a series of books, including Travels in the Oregon Territory, Travels in the Great Western Prairies, and Travels in the Californias and Scenes in the Pacific. Another simplistic but very useful guide was written by John M. Shively on his return from the Oregon Territory in 1845. While only about 15 pages in length, it contained practical information about the trail, including terrain and distances, as well as advice on how to prepare for the journey. However, it would soon be overshadowed by the works of a young man from Ohio. Lansford W. Hastings, a young lawyer, headed west in 1842 to explore Oregon and California. Ever ambitious, Hastings viewed the territories, especially California, as opportunities for him to leave his mark on history. Hastings wrote a guide that would be at the center of one of the most horrific tragedies of the westward migrations, the Donner Party. Approximately 155 pages, the guide was mostly just a record of his travels west and a description of the territories, with less than flattering descriptions of the Mexican and Native American inhabitants. Containing very little practical information, the guide was widely panned, but it contained two passages that generate controversy even today.
Wagons can be as readily taken from Fort Hall to the Bay of San Francisco as they can from the States to Fort Hall. And in fact, the latter part of the route is found much more eligible for a wagonway than the former.
And the second?
The most direct route for the California emigrants would be to leave the Oregon route, about 200 miles east from Fort Hall, thence bearing southwest to the Salt Lake, and thence continuing down to the Bay of San Francisco by the route just described.
The problem was Lansford Hastings was offering advice on how to get to California, never having traveled either of the routes he described in his guide. Those who took the route in the second passage, which would become known as the Hastings Cutoff, and later called the Road to Death, soon learned that his advice had placed them in peril. As time progressed, better guides were developed that provided valuable advice and guidance to westbound pioneers. Considered one of the most useful was the guide published by Overton Johnson and William H. Winter in 1846, Noted for its unbiased description of the journey and the territories west of the Missouri River, it provided useful information on planning for and undertaking a journey to Oregon or California. The appendix was chock full of good advice on everything from clothing to food to the kinds of teams the immigrants should use to pull their wagons. But one of the most notable features was its waypoints, which provided detailed descriptions of mileages and what the pioneers could expect to find, and in some cases not find, along the trail. As the trails became more developed, cartographers such as Thomas H. Jefferson of the Hoppy Party of 1846 created increasingly detailed maps of the routes. These maps would eventually provide a complete picture and a set of guideposts for the journey from Missouri and Iowa to California and Oregon. And of course, there were the reports of John C. Fremont and his expeditions during the 1840s. While they were actually just records of his travels, they were still useful in providing detailed images and information about the mountains, valleys, rivers, and deserts of the territories of the West. Over the course of the westward migrations from the early 1840s through the 1860s, the Oregon, California, and Santa Fe trails would grow into an extensive network of routes that guided over 400,000 settlers to new homes filled with hopes and dreams. The guides and maps developed by those early pioneers, explorers, and cartographers would provide the tracings for even more significant changes in the Wild West. From those faint lines, we saw the rise of the Pony Express, the Intercontinental Railroad, the Overland Stage, and even today's interstate highway system. Little did the travelers in the mid-1800s know that the exit they were about to take would lead them to their place in history and forever change the landscape of the West.